My name is Stephen McAteer. I'm the director here at the MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, and we're just delighted that you've turned out for what is going to be a great presentation tonight. Just as a matter for my edification, how many of you are from Hot Springs tonight? I knew there was a group here that I could tell by the level of camaraderie. How many of you went to school with Hugh and Ron? Okay. Well, we're delighted that we were able to give you an opportunity to... I'm not going there, okay? You can ask them. In just a few minutes, you will have the floor. You can ask them anything you want. Again, we're delighted that you're here tonight with us. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, a conflict in which over 2.7 million Americans fought, 72,000 of which came from Arkansas, and more than 58,000 Americans lost their lives, approximately 600 from our state, whose names are listed on a banner on display in our Vietnam gallery. Our guest tonight is one of those Arkansans who served his country, fought in Vietnam, came home, and had a distinguished military career. Hugh Mills, and let me see if I can get this correct here. Great. Hugh Mills, a native of Hot Springs and a proud graduate of Hot Springs High School, is one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in the Vietnam War. He commanded the Aero Scouts Platoon, the Outcasts of D Troop, where he developed many of the Army's air, cavalry, Aero Scout tactics. That's hard to say. Later, he flew and commanded a squadron of Cobra helicopters, and he is also the co-author of a book, Low Level Hell, a scout pilot in the Big Red One, which recounts his experiences in Vietnam. We just this afternoon got some of these in for our gift shop, so if you would like to purchase one and have him sign it, he's very generously offered to do that. You can purchase them in our gift shop downstairs. Colonel Mills, that's the commercial. Colonel Mills flew more than 3,300 combat hours. 3,300. Think about that, how many days that has to be. That's amazing. He retired in 1993 after 26 years as a combat aviator. His medals include 3 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, 6 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 3 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and the multitude of other medals and awards which are listed on the screen. In 2013, he was inducted into the Arkansas Military Veterans Hall of Fame, and we are very proud that for several years now we've had an exhibit on his life featuring his uniform, his flight helmet, and his medals located in our own Vietnam gallery. So please join me in welcoming Colonel Hugh Mills.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. First of all, I want to thank the museum for asking me to come. Sharon and I drove down from Kansas City to Rogers yesterday. My brother is there. And spent the night and then drove in this morning. The weather between Rogers and here was just terrible. You shouldn't have been out. You saw what it did to Springfield, right? We drove through the middle of that. It tore up the Springfield airport. It was terrible. Well, a couple of things before I begin and show you a few things. I want to thank a couple of people for coming. One of them is one of my oldest friends, Ron Fuller, who's standing back there in the back. Those of you with the museum may know Ron, and not only is he one of my oldest friends, I've known him for a long time, and we joined each other in the 6th grade at Ramble Elementary School, which no longer exists, and we both fought over the same girl, Linda Reeder. I'm going to tell you about her, Sue, later on. Gene Robinson, who just came back to the United States. Where's Gene? There he is, back in the back. 29 years off with the Customs and Border Inspection Service, was a high school classmate of mine. Major General Walter Paulson, right here. Stand up, Walt. He's right there with Ron. We hooked up in the 7th grade together, and I attribute almost all of his success in life to sitting by me in junior high school. So I would also introduce my wife, Sharon, is sitting on the back row. You'll see Sharon, stand up. You cannot get the Baptist out of them. She's always on the back row. By way of background, I was born in Memphis, April the 8th, 1948. Just had my 77th birthday. My dad was the principal of the high school in Monticello. And we lived in Monticello till 1959, and the family moved to Hot Springs, where he became superintendent of schools. Was there until 1966. And then he went to the University of Arkansas, where he was dean of continuing education until his retirement many years later. I went off to Arkansas Tech in June of 1966, July, whenever you get out of high school. Did really well in ROTC and the Sport Parachute Club. Everything else was an abysmal failure. So I took that as a clue, and I enlisted in the Army as a paratrooper in February 1967 as a private E0. Went to basic training, advanced individual training as an infantryman, won the Blue Cord, very proud of that, and then selected for officer candidate school. And I didn't know what officer candidate school was. And I called my dad and I said, look, I got to give up an assignment to the 82nd Airborne Division that I really want to go to this thing called OCS. And he said, oh, you're going. If I have to come down there, you're going. So I did. Graduated from Armor OCS in December of 1967 as a second lieutenant of cavalry at the age of 19. I then went off to flight school. Spent a year in Army Flight School, Fort Walters, Texas, and then Fort Rucker, Alabama, and then directly to Vietnam. And most of what you're going to see here is the first tour of 1969 with the 1st Infantry Division, and that was the majority of the information that I wrote about. Low-level hell is my first tour in Vietnam in 1969 with the 1st Infantry Division. So we will jump right into it. One of my favorite quotes, you guys may not know who this guy is, but some of you will. When you need help, you don't want the Lone Ranger, you want the whole United States Cavalry. Who do you think said that? Anybody know? It wasn't me. Captain Scott O'Grady was an F-16 pilot shot down in Bosnia and evaded capture for several days until he was rescued, unfortunately not by the United States Cavalry, but by the United States Marine Corps, God bless them. But you understand where he's coming from. In my assignments in combat, I first served with D Troop, 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry. Call sign was Dark Horse, 1969. I went back in 1971 to serve D Troop, 3rd of the 5th Cavalry, 101st Airborne Division. And then when that unit stood down, I elected to stay in country and extended for another tour and flew with C Troop, 16th Cavalry. Very confusing, same unit, Dark Horse, that I was in 1969. However, when the 1st Division went home, one unit stayed in Vietnam, and that was the Air Cavalry Troop, Dark Horse. And they simply redesignated themselves as C Troop 16th Cavalry. But when you look at the lineage in the Army historical records, D Troop 14 is the same unit as C Troop 16. Aviation organizations in Vietnam, largest different grouping of aviation units in the history of the Army. There they are. All those things were in Vietnam when I was there. They had air assault divisions, the 101st Airborne Division, Air Mobile, the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. The largest unit, arguably, in all of Vietnam was the 1st Aviation Brigade. Although a brigade is smaller than a division, the number of separate units, everything that was not divisional or brigade related, fell under the auspices of the 1st Aviation Brigade. Each individual division had their own aviation battalion, and then there were cavalry squadrons, such as I served in. An armored cavalry squadron had 1 air cav troop and 3 troops of tanks. An air cavalry squadron had 3 air cav troops and 1 troop of ground troops, usually jeep mounted. And then there were separate air cav troops in separate companies. And I promise you, after a couple of these, the silly slides will go away. They're a lot more fun later on. But this is what an air cavalry troop looked like in 1969. Commanded by an 04, an Army major, aviator, 32 aircraft, 55 wheel vehicles, 10 commissioned officers, 38 warrant officers, 130 enlisted men, 4 platoons. The Aero Scout Platoon, which is the unit that I commanded, had 10 OH-6 aircraft, 2 vehicles used principally for going to and from the officers' club and accessing other units like the Air Force, from which we stole everything we could get our hands on. 2 commissioned officers, normally a captain. I will be very candid with you. No captain wanted to command the Aero Scouts because of the nature of what we did, and I commanded that unit as a first lieutenant, brand new first lieutenant, for a year. Aero Lift Platoon, 10 Huey helicopters, the same number of pilots, 2 commissioned officers, 18 warrants. It's a 2-person aircraft. The Loach, which I had, was a 1-person aircraft. The Aero Weapon Platoon was 10 AH-1G Cobras, the assorted pilots and enlisted crew chiefs. And that last platoon, the Aero Rifle Platoon, made it the most unique unit in any organization in Vietnam. A rifle platoon of U.S. Army Rangers, organic to an air cavalry troop. And they rode into battle with that second platoon, the Aero Lift Platoon. And what made them unusual is that they were with us. We didn't have to go get them on standby. They were part of our unit. So if we lost an aircraft, I had 28 guys that would jump on their Hueys and come roaring out to bring us home. Those bonds of friendship and camaraderie exist to this day. We're getting together mid-June in San Antonio for another annual reunion, and the Aero Rifles come to that just like the pilots and the crew chiefs do. I don't know what that did. Okay, these were our roles and missions. The principal role for the cavalry, traditionally from the plains of the Midwest all the way till today, reconnaissance and security, economy of force. Armed attack, principally by the Cobra gunships. If you team up a scout helicopter with a Cobra helicopter, you've got a hunter-killer team. We did downed air crew recovery. 123 personnel rescued by my unit in 1969 alone. Mostly Air Force and ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Occasionally some Navy guys, most of whom apparently were lost to be over 3 Corps and get shot down. Tactical emergencies, I know we got 1 Navy guy in the crew. I saw his hat, so that's why I said that. We got 2, Pat's a Navy too, yeah. Tactical emergencies, responding to troops in contact. Ground reconnaissance with that rifle platoon. We could put those guys on the ground and literally check documents of Vietnamese people that we found around our area of operations to determine whether or not they were Viet Cong, North Vietnamese regulars, or pure civilians. Eagle Flights was launching off into the area with Vietnamese police. The guys in country called them white mice because they wore a white helmet. And then the ARPs also did LRP, which is long range reconnaissance patrol, observation posts during the daytime and listening posts at night. Very, very uniquely qualified and diverse unit. This is who we fought. When I got there in January of 1969, it was almost 100% North Vietnamese main force regular troops. Occasionally we'd get into Viet Cong guerrillas. My favorite story is that in June of 1969, there was a small VC attack on our perimeter at Phu Loi in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone. And one of the guys that they found dead in the wire the next morning was the civilian that ran the barber shop of my unit. He'd been shaving me for 4 months, and he was a main force VC. We had to get a new barber. That was the hardest part. Light infantry sappers are those who are trained to infiltrate your perimeter at night. Some artillery, and generally in the area where I was in '69, medium to light anti-aircraft fire, 23 millimeter down. Up north in I Corps, 85 millimeter radar guided guns, 23 millimeter. The Strela was an SA-7 ground to air guided missile, which was introduced in April of 1972. I was on my 3rd tour when the Strela came around. Generally in '69, the guns flew about 1,500 feet. The scouts flew about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. The high threat, when the Strela was introduced, meant everybody was down low level trying to avoid the SA-7 missile. The things that we didn't have in 1969, are there any aviation warrants in the room at all? Any old aviation? Good, I can talk about them. GPS, Global Positioning System, we didn't have that. Our navigation aid was an HHM. You know what that is? That's a handheld map. That's what we navigated with. Vietnam had no nav aids for the pilots in the room, no VORs, a few NDBs, non-directional beacons. We used those to listen to AFVN radio. You guys have seen Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams. I would tune in Saigon radio on my NDB in the aircraft and flip up the monitor switch and listen to music in the headphones while I was scouting. I didn't need to navigate back to base. I knew where my base was. I didn't need to use that for navigation. We didn't have night vision goggles. We didn't have a lot of exterior illumination. When you flew out of your base in Vietnam, everything you could see in front of you was pitch black. Weren't any towns, weren't any street lights. All the civilians had been pulled into pacified areas. So when you flew at night especially, and the scouts did not fly much at night because we tended to run into things, and I'll show you some of that in a minute, but when we flew at night, when I flew gunships on my 2nd tour, we flew time, distance, and heading. We would take off from Phu Bai on a heading of 270, go for 32 minutes, and then try to get the guy we were going to help on the radio and get him to show us either a strobe light or a flare or something. So amenities, we didn't have a lot of those. Crew rest was in its infancy in Vietnam. Currently, National Guard aviators in the state of Kansas fly about 80 hours a year. That's terrible. We flew 140 hours a month. When I left Vietnam, my first tour, I had 1,500 hours of combat time. So the operation tempo was way different then than it was now. Experience was the big thing. You know, when we went to Desert Storm, we had guys from W1 to W5 and from 2nd lieutenant through full colonel and brigadier general that had extensive combat time and flight time. The entire time I was in Dark Horse, my first tour, no warrant officers over the grade of W1. That's a year or less of service. No W2s, 3s, or 4s. W5 didn't exist in those days. So my opinion is that we were not necessarily in Vietnam at 10 years at that point. We were in Vietnam 10 times for a year at a time. Experience at the end of a year, you went home. Desert Storm units went to the war and came home together as units. Absolutely the way to do it. But we were an army of replacements. We would serve a year and then go home. No women. The only women I saw in the entire 1969 were what we call donut dollies. They were gals from the the Red Cross who would come. They were morale support folks. They would come in and play board games with the soldiers and play their guitar, and it made the soldiers feel a little bit more like home. The ones you didn't want to see were the nurses, because if you got to see a nurse, you were shot. So it wasn't really worth it for that. And the best part, lawyers. I never saw a lawyer. Sorry, Paul. Pepper. Pepper's also a lawyer. But he's an oil lawyer. He's not really a criminal lawyer. But rules of engagement were far different than they were. And we were very, very particular about using the force that we used. We were able to use not only our organic firepower, but we also adjusted artillery, tanks, battleships. I got to adjust the New Jersey one time while I was there on my second tour. It's amazing to see 16-inch shells coming off a battleship. It looks like Volkswagens flying through the air. What we did have was full latitude and rules of engagement control. The areas that we flew in were free fire zones. However, if there was a suspicion that the person that we encountered was not a combatant, we didn't shoot him. The way you could tell the difference, in my experience, and I was a scout flying very low, very, very close to them, eye to eye, if they would look at you and smile at you, they were friendly. If they would avert their gaze and not look at you, they were normally enemy. I had a guy in Cambodia in 1972 that was sitting under a tree with an AK-47 rifle in his lap, and he just looked at me and smiled the whole time. And I said, I don't know if he's a North Vietnamese soldier, a Khmer Rouge, or a civilian that found a rifle, but he's smiling at me, so I'm not going to shoot him, and I didn't. Everything that we flew was brand new. The OH-6, which you'll see in just a minute, had an intermediate maintenance phase of 300 hours. Not one of my aircraft ever made it to intermediate. Not one. My platoon had 10 aircraft, and in 1969 I went through 36 OH-6s. 36. If we had one damaged, we would simply send it to depot, go to Saigon to the replacement unit down there and pick up a new helicopter and bring it back. Everything we flew had somewhere between 30 and 70 hours on it. Tremendous, brand new stuff. Most of the guys were young. When I took command of the Aero Scouts, I was 20. That's pretty young. The only thing worse than a second lieutenant in a map is a 20-year-old second lieutenant with a map. Very few of the guys were married. In the scout platoon, 100% volunteers. No one was assigned to fly Aero Scouts because of the nature of the job. And of the one guy, we didn't take married guys in the Scouts. We had one guy that fought me about flying Scouts. His name was Joe Vad. You'll see a picture of him later on. He's the only one I had that was married, and he was killed in November of '69. His daughter, who lives in Nova Scotia, and I remain in close contact. The biggest thing is flexibility to innovate. Everything we were doing was brand new. The Army had no manual on air cavalry operations and Aero Scout operations. I later wrote the Army manual for Aero Scout operations at Fort Knox in 1973. But great initiative to innovate. This is the OH-6, and that's about the altitude we flew most of the time. It's made by the Hughes Tool Company. You've all heard of Howard Hughes. That was his company, Culver City, California, and he put this aircraft out. This is a 1972 paint scheme. We put the shark's teeth on it because it truly, truly annoyed the North Vietnamese soldiers. It scared the pee-wadding out of them. And then the guy in the back is the crew chief, and that's about the way they flew. They were secured to the aircraft with a thing called a monkey strap, so that they had movement. They carried a machine gun. You'll see that later on. But if we ever did something aggressive with the aircraft and lost them out the door, they only went about 2 feet because they had this strap on them. Once in a while, I had to land and get the guy to get back in the airplane. This is where scouting began for the Army. This is a Bell 47. You've all seen MASH. That's the MASH helicopter, OH-13. with skid-mounted machine guns. That's where the Army started to think about arming scout ships. It would not carry 2 personnel and 2 machine guns with a full load of ammunition. So the Army entered into a construction phase to replace the Bell 47 or H-13, and the winner of that fly-off was the Hughes Tool Company or Hughes Helicopters, and the 086 was the winner. This is the Bell 23D. This is what I flew in flight school. Pretty basic aircraft, 1955 vintage. We spent the first 6 months of our training at Fort Walters, Texas, Mineral Wells, flying these things, and then off to Fort Rucker, Alabama for another 6 months, all turbine with the UH-1. This is the 086 as configured in combat. People always ask me about the armor plate. Well, there really wasn't much. This gray part is armor, and it was a bucket, essentially below you and to the side, on the right side, and then if you were in the right seat, that armor is actually in the left seat, which for us was almost always unoccupied. The crew chief flew back here in the back. Right under his seat, that thing right there is a tungsten carbide plate that was attached to the bottom of his seat with a strap, and that would deflect gunfire. But his armor was right here. It was called a chicken plate. And it was a tungsten carbide front and back. The pilots only wore the front because we had the back armor right here. But the aircraft was 317 shaft horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in a helicopter that only weighs about 2,200 pounds, very fast, very nimble, very maneuverable. And I fell in love with it. When you go to flight school, one of the things that you've got to do is take an orientation flight in an Army aircraft. And I was at Fort Knox as an officer candidate, and I went down to the airfield to do my little orientation flight, and it happened to be one of these, brand new, 1967, brand new. I'd never even seen one, and they gave me a ride in this thing, and I was sold. I said, that is exactly what I want to fly. So long as you weren't scared of the event and didn't throw up, you could go to flight school. So that was the big requirement. This is the aircraft that I'm most, I don't like the word famous, I'm most noted for. This is 17340, which hangs from the ceiling of the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker. That's the last aircraft I flew in combat, and they were good enough to save it after the war. And if you ever go to Fort Rucker, wonderful museum, this is hanging from the ceiling. And the great news is this aircraft will last longer than the pilot and the crew chief that flew it. My crew chief, Jimmy Christie, died several years ago. And then once I'm gone, the only thing left is 340. And I've asked the Army if I can be cremated and put in an urn and put in the pilot seat hanging from the ceiling, and they've not gotten back to me on that yet. This is another one of our aircraft. This is Disciple of Peace. Mike King, first lieutenant, was the pilot of this particular aircraft. This shows you how the crew chiefs actually flew in the aircraft. They flew sideways. M60 machine gun was their principal argument. What he's pointing to is a bullet hole. The crew chiefs in the Army did exceptional duty because not only did they fly as gunners with us, they were also the maintainers of the aircraft. So when we got back at the end of the day, these guys had to get it ready to fly again the next day. And sometimes they would work into the night, replacing, you had to cover up bullet holes. You know the best thing to cover bullet holes in an Army helicopter? Beer cans. Beer cans. Wonderful metal, about the same as the aircraft skin. Put them in a circle, rivet them on there, and sometimes paint them green. Sometimes leave them where they say Coors. This is my favorite guy on earth, Jimmy Parker, who was my crew chief. This is me leaving Like on a scramble mission, and Jimmy in the back seat getting his M60 together. Jimmy lives in Calhoun, Georgia. He's still with us. On this mission, about 2 hours later, we engaged a number of enemy troops on the bank of a river. And after that engagement, I took off to head on up the river. And Jimmy keyed up his interphone and he said, "Sir, if you're done, can we go to a hospital?" And I turned around and looked through the bulkhead, and he'd been shot through the neck, went in here and came out here. And we flew down to Second Surge at Lac and got him fixed up, and he got to go off to Okinawa for 6 weeks and recover. But you can see that the gunners back here don't have much protection at all. And the pilot, the way we flew, most of us is sticking out too. So heavily maneuverable and armed, but not armored. This is the Cobra gunship. Bell Helicopter in Fort Worth, Texas made these. This is an early Cobra. You can tell the early Cobra because they had a landing light in the nose and they had a blue canopy. That canopy turned out to be a bad color for nighttime operations, so they changed it to clear. But it's got rocket pods on the side, 19 shot, 2.75 rocket pods, and minigun pods on the inboard. And then in the turret, which is fired by the guy in the front seat, is a minigun, 7.62, and a 40 millimeter grenade launcher. Very, very fast aircraft with a lot of firepower. Essentially, it's a Huey scaled down, 36 inches wide at the waist, 42 inches wide at the canopy. This was Widowmaker, one of our Cobras in 1969. This is the Cobra that I flew on my second tour. A couple of things I wanted to point out. We have the addition in 71 of this thing right here. This is a M35 20 millimeter Gatling gun that was added to the Cobra to fight the 50 caliber machine gun. At 1,500 feet, a 50 caliber machine gun will tear up a helicopter. With the Gatling gun, 20 millimeter high explosive, we could stand off 5,000 feet and tear them up. The other thing is these rockets right here in the outboard pod, you see that it looks like golf balls kind of on the end of them. Those are proximity fuse rockets. In the Delta, if a rocket hits a soft surface, a swampy surface, they would bury themselves before they blew up. Not very effective. The white projectiles in this particular picture are proximity fuses. They would go off 8 to 10 feet above the ground before they hit things, which was very cool. They also went off if you shot them in the rain, so you had to be careful. You'd shoot them out in front of you in a heavy rain and they'd blow up right in front of you. This is the way I flew to combat every day. That's me flying on the wing of Captain Dean Shiner. I'm a single pilot aircraft flying from the right seat. I flew with them, echelon left, until he told me where he wanted me to go down. They were working the map in the Cobra. I was doing the talking. So we'd pick up a terrain feature like where these 2 points come together. And he'd tell me to go down over that and then take up a heading of 270. And once I did that, I would then call out anything that I saw on the ground that was unusual. Enemy traffic, we were man trackers. We tracked people by their footprints. We discovered base camps in areas because of things like right angles, camouflage that they had put out that had dried up and it was no longer very effective. And whatever I would say on the radio, I would say on UHF, and the Cobra would talk to me on VHF. So we never stepped on each other. I was never in a position where I couldn't be heard when I was screaming for help. I'd peel off on the left-hand side and go down low level, and then that's about where we would operate, 4 to 6 feet above the highest terrain in the scout ships. Right about there. Now these are friendly civilians. We as much as we could, we would attempt not to upset their lives. I will tell you that a water buffalo who's been spooked by a helicopter and has got a 15-year-old kid on the back of it is a hoot to watch running through a rice paddy. But very seldom did we ever operate around friendlies. We just weren't in areas where the friendlies were. This is about the view that the enemy would have of a scout ship. So you can see it wasn't hard. I will tell you that the vast majority of the people that shoot at you would not use a lead. They would shoot directly at you and you'd be ahead of it. Most of the rounds that would hit me in the back in here, tail boom. The engine had a very small box right there that covered the fuel control, but not any armor plate on the engine either. For those of you who have read Low Level Hell, I know a couple of you have, this is Thunder Road, and this is that event. We were providing convoy cover for a convoy early one morning, and they were hit. This area that you see looks to you like jungle and so on. It's not. That's already been cleared. That's how fast the jungle comes back. But that is a transport truck, a fuel tanker, that was hit by a mine in the road right there and exploded. And then the enemy hit from both sides. And I was caught actually over the convoy when they were hit from two sides. So to escape, I had to fly down the convoy. But that's chapter 1 called Thunder Road in the book. These are guys after the fact. This thing right here is my crew chief's M60 machine gun. You can see that. He took that picture. But all of this area has already been cleared and it started to grow back. It grew back very, very fast. Now, I'm only going to show you 2 objectionable pictures, but they bear a purpose. These are 3 North Vietnamese soldiers that got past all the screening that was done that morning. One's right there, one's right there, and one's right there. These 3 were killed by my crew chief when we flew over and looked into a small hole, and he could see them looking up out of what we called a spider hole and told me to do a quick turn, and as I did, he engaged them. All 3 of them had rocket-propelled grenade launchers, one of which is hanging in the Vietnam room. You can see what those look like. But you can see that these guys are North Vietnamese regulars. They're wearing green uniforms. This guy, for some reason, that's an RPG that's underneath him right there, was carrying a red bag for some reason. Why a guy would go into combat with a red flag on him like that was a mystery to me. But this is an area, if you see the tracks, those tracks are from armored personnel carriers that had already gone through there that morning, and these guys were hiding in these holes in the jungle there. We also did river patrol, usually first light and last light. If you've got guys on the rivers were principal areas of transportation in Vietnam, especially in the Delta. The Mekong Delta is the rice bowl of Southeast Asia. And occasionally you'd run onto guys like this. Now, is this a bad guy or a good guy? What do you think? Can you tell? What did I say before? He's not looking at you. He was a South Vietnamese Viet Cong, and there were weapons under that mat right there. But that's how you could tell. If they would look at you, they weren't afraid of you. And if they weren't afraid of you, there was no real reason to consider them an adversary. One of the problems we had was running into stuff. I think I mentioned that. I had the wonderful idea one day to have my crew chief paint crossed cavalry sabers on the front of my aircraft. I thought that'd be very cool. And then the very next day, I ran into a dead tree. When you're scouting, you're looking out the right door and you're flying in a concentric right-hand orbit in a straight line. And I was watching what I was scouting about, and a dead tree stuck up, and I didn't really see it, and I ran into it and knocked the entire bubble out of it. Not the worst thing I've done, but you'll see one of those in a minute. One of the weapons that we dealt with, if you've read the book again, the chapter called Hot Dogging It, early one morning flying from point A to point B, I happened to come over a Nipa palm line at Nap of the Earth, and spread out right in front of me was a 28-man North Vietnamese heavy weapons platoon. These are the weapons that were recovered after that fight. That's me standing right there in that flight suit. But that's an RPD 30 caliber machine gun with an anti-aircraft mount. That's a 50 caliber anti-aircraft gun sitting in front of our troop headquarters. We captured that with a rope and a hook and drug that back to base and put that right in front of the troop headquarters. And as you can see with the cavalry, our first sergeant demanded that everything be painted red and white. So it was. This is a ship that I was shot down in June of 1969. It looks worse than it was. If anybody want to know what the actual result of the wound looked like, which was my right and left buttock, my wife will tell you all about that. But this is me, that's what happened when I crawled out. That's what the aircraft looked like. The beautiful thing about the OH-6, it was made to survive combat damage. It was made to shed the skids, shed the blades, and shed the tail and roll itself up into a ball. The aircraft was built around a truss A-frame, which basically held the aircraft together, and it would roll up in a ball, and then the crew would come out. I've only seen a post-crash fire in an OH-6 once, and that particular crew happened to land on a stump of an old tree, which penetrated the fuel cell, and it caught on fire. But for the most part, a very, very survivable aircraft. In the course of 3 tours, I was shot down 16 times, 15 times in OH-6s. My roommate was a guy named Rod Willis. Rod lives in Kansas City. He and I served 2 tours together, 69 and 72, as roommates, both as scout pilots. And one night, I was washing my chicken plate carrier. They get a little gamey in that environment. And I was washing the carrier, and my roommate reached down and picked up the core, the tungsten carbide core, and he drew a bullseye, thinking he was funny. 2 days later, I was wearing that plate and took 2 hits, one right there and one right there. One of those hits was dead center in the bullseye. I beat on Lieutenant Willis for about a week for doing that. But that's the armor that we carried. That's what it looked like. It was in a green canvas carrier, a lot like catcher's gear. But it was rigid, it was very heavy, but it would, as you can see, save your life. This is a pilot, this is Tim Colberg. We lost Tim Colberg 3 weeks ago, pancreatic cancer. But this is what the chicken plate looks like when it's worn. Tim is wearing a standard Nomex uniform with a chicken plate, the SPH-4 flight helmet. If you see how he's carrying his pistol, that is optimistic in terms of self-protection. I can tell you, if you got hit on a pistol worn in that manner, you would come away a high tenor. What's interesting about this picture, though, this is the first public viewing of that thing right there, which is the infrared heat diffuser that was put on the Loaches in 1972 when that Strela missile was introduced into the theater. The protection for the aircraft was to block up the rear exhaust and reroute the exhaust upward into the rotor blades to dissipate the heat. So that is the first upward exhaust on an OH-6 in Vietnam. One of my favorite pictures, this is taken from a Cobra flown by a guy named John Leskovic. I was flying up this river when I was taken under fire by an enemy machine gun located right there on this little peninsula. And as I turned in to engage with the minigun, that's what that is. One of his rounds penetrated my aircraft and punctured a white phosphorus grenade in my back seat with my crew chief. White phosphorus, when exposed to the air, does that. It explodes. Now, amazingly, Jimmy Christie, who was in the back seat, was not hurt at all. I kicked the aircraft sideways to get most of that to blow out the outside, but that's a split-second shot that John took, and the aircraft should have exploded. Aircraft should have gone up, but it didn't. What does that prove? God's a Republican, absolutely. That's 340 again, we've seen that. When I talk about innovation, this is not a standard armament configuration for an OH-6. This is actually a rocket pod off an O-1 Bird Dog forward air controller. And we got that, it was Air Force. We got that off the wings of the aircraft one night and mounted it on our aircraft, which is pretty neat. You couldn't hit very much with it because we didn't have the sighting system. But we experimented with a lot of things. Here is a 4-shot rocket pod on the side of the OH-6. Today, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment has 2 pods of these on each side of their aircraft. This is where they first appeared in the OH-6 series in Vietnam. Every once in a while, we would knock off more than our front end. In this particular one, I knocked the gear off by hitting a tree and had to hover at the flight line where they built this little cradle out of sandbags until I could set the aircraft down on it. It also got the tail. But if you look at the aircraft, you can see how new. I think this aircraft had 16, 17 hours on it when we did that. So we would put it in the back of a truck, send it to depot maintenance, and go get a new one. You don't do that anymore. Took the crew chiefs a long time. Poor guys had to fill all those sandbags and move them over there and make a cradle to sit on. Just sit the aircraft down on it because without skids, it'll roll over and the blades will tear it up. This is refuel and rearm point in Vietnam. Various bases around that very high mountain. Back in the background is Nua Ba Dinh in 3rd Corps. The Black Virgin Mountain is what it was called. And we'd fly into these unattended bases, and there would be fuel pumps and stacks of rockets and ammunition, and we would land, fire the generator up, fill our aircraft up with fuel, help the rocket guys load rockets on the Cobras, and off we would go again. But this is essentially the first FARP, forward area refueling point. The Army routinely uses this today. That's Mike King again, he's taken off. That's the Mekong Delta, that's Jimmy and I going to Phnom Penh, Cambodia for a particular operation to guard river boats on the Mekong River. A lot of downtime. That's me asleep on the skid of the airplane. That's Tim Kohlberg, who we just lost, sitting in the back. While one team was out flying, we would rearm, refuel, and sit, wait for them to come back and refuel, rearm, we would go out. So we would cycle crews out from anywhere from about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning till about 7 o'clock at night. Routinely, the scouts did not fly at night because our mission was low level. Again, we flew on the wing of the Cobra. That's Exterminator. Now, if you ever wondered what happens when you leave 19-year-old Army aviation warrant officers unattended, this is what happens. They go over to the Navy base next door and they get 250-pound high explosive bombs and bring them over and mount them on the wing shackles of their Cobras to see if they can drop bombs off Cobra helicopters, which has never been made to drop a bomb in the history of the world. But these guys in my unit did that with a 250-pound bomb. And then they had to do all that stuff like World War II. Remember the Alamo and first bomb to be dropped in combat. When the troop commander found out about this, they got in a lot of trouble for that. But again, innovation was welcome. I was flying, this is the Mekong Delta 1972. This is kind of a fun story for me. We had a unit administration officer named James Craig Adamson. Jim was a West Pointer, and his job in the unit was administration. He was a pilot, but all he did was administration. And he came to me one day and says, I want to come and fly scouts with you. And I said, you sure you want to do that? And he said, sure, I do. I want to do that. So I took him out, and we're flying. And right back in here, we're following a trail of some guys that had hit a Vietnamese post the night before. And we could see their trail headed back toward Cambodia. And along that trail, I found a smoking cigarette. And I told Jim in my back seat, I said, that smoking cigarette means the guy that was smoking it is real close to us, because they burn out real quick. So wherever he is, he's close. And I said, he's over at the base of this big tree. And Jim said, how do you know that? I said, just trust me, that's where it is. I said, I'm going to fly over there. That's actually my aircraft right there, taken from the Cobra. I said, when I turn over the top of that big tree, you're going to look straight down. You're going to find North Vietnamese soldiers. I guarantee it. Open up on them, because they're going to open up on you. And we did that, and then we fired a smoke in there, and then the Cobras got to shoot. James Craig Adamson, I'll show you his picture a little bit later. I thought it was next, but it's not. You're going to see him again in a minute. But that was the distance that we flew. The height of a tree, or just above the ground, is where we spent most of our time. When you went to flight school, you started with Hueys. That's a B model Huey. And in the back end of it, they would put 55-gallon drums and fill them up with water, and that simulated the load. It would barely get out of its own way with that kind of a load. But that's Fort Rucker, and that's a B model Huey. When we got to Vietnam, these are our guys. These are the 4 horsemen, the lift platoon. And every morning they would set up their helicopters, and the aero rifle guys would go out there and put their gear aboard the helicopter and then relax, wait for them to be called forward. Our Hueys were specially armed in some cases. This is the M134 minigun mounted on the helicopter. It's a Gatling gun, 30 caliber, 308. On the other side, we had night vision searchlights, and that's a searchlight, a Xeon searchlight off a tank. That's a night observation device. And they'd fly around at night using the night vision, and then when they got the enemy spotted, they would use the tank searchlight and then open up on them with the minigun. On this side of this particular Huey, we've got a 50, for those of you who've been in the military, this is the big deuce right here. The Ma Deuce 50 caliber machine gun, that will do a number, and then a minigun beside it. Not standard ordnance on the Huey. Normal Huey armament was an M60 machine gun. When the Slicks flew into combat, they flew in a flight of 4, and as they got near to the target, you could see the guys rode in the back on the floor. We didn't have seats in the aircraft; they just sat on the floor. And as they got closer to combat, the Hueys would go trail formation and into a landing zone. This is Bob Harris. For those of you who have read or will read the book, this is Dark Horse 46. He was the rifle platoon leader of our Aero Rifle Platoon. And my favorite person on earth right there, that's Doc Morgan. Doc Morgan is from rural Athens, Tennessee. He was a Pentecostal minister, conscientious objector, would not carry a weapon, and he was the unit medic. And in the middle of a firefight one day, Doc stood up in a hot landing zone and walked about 40 yards and picked up a wounded guy and brought him back, and was not injured at all, saved the guy's life. And Bob used to tell Bob that he obviously stood well with the Almighty and to stay close to him. So we lost Bob Harris a couple of years ago to Parkinson's and malignant cancer, but Doc is still with us. I'll see him in June in San Antonio. Once the ARPs are on the ground, they would move toward a target. This is Stu Harrell, who was the platoon leader after Bob Harris. But the scouts would go out and find the target and put a smoke on it, because often where they were walking, they couldn't see. The infantry guy in Vietnam had great difficulty in seeing where he was going. We'd put a smoke on the enemy location and then fly overhead to protect the ARPs as they move forward. We could see straight down. They couldn't see straight ahead in many cases. So it was a wonderful relationship that abides to this day. The scouts, you can see that's typical non-triple canopy jungle. That's just routine jungle. And it's up over their head. We had these guys in the unit. These are called Kit Carson Scouts. Kit Carsons were North Vietnamese or Viet Cong who had rallied to the other side. They had come to the government side, and they served as interpreters. These are two brothers named Roy and Toy. Both Roy and Toy were both killed in '69, about September. But these guys spoke the language. They had been in the field with opposing forces. They knew how they lived. And when these guys got tense and said, "Buku VC," that sort of thing, they knew that the guys on the ground were getting close to trouble. This was Sergeant Nguyen. Sergeant Nguyen was a South Vietnamese, ethnic North Vietnamese. But when the war began, he emigrated to South Vietnam. He was a history teacher in Hanoi, and he became the interpreter. He spoke English fluently. The Kit Carsons didn't speak English. This was our platoon sergeant, Sergeant Prokop. Prokop was about 6'7". And as you can see, he stood up above everybody else. Once the ARPs are on the ground, that's my aircraft right there. There was a sampan, enemy sampan right in here that we found, and we're going to put the ARPs on the ground. The ARPs are actually on this tree line right here. We had inserted them. I've got the sampan burning. It had a .50 caliber on the deck, and we hit it with a minigun, got it burning. That's my aircraft again. But we could put the guys on the ground, and they could actually walk up, evaluate what was on the ground, capture enemy documents and personnel, and so on. That's the 086. These are the ARPs. You can see them walking here. Very, very lush jungle, hard to navigate. We had a beautiful observation point from where we sat. One of my favorite pictures, this is Wayne McAdoo, who was the platoon commander of the lift platoon. Anybody see anything in that picture that stands out to you? Anything at all?
The helmet?
No. We painted our helmets. We did. That's a camouflage painted helmet. But his crew chief, very innovative young man, had a J.C. Whitney catalog, and he sent off and got wood paneling for the dashboard of the Huey. Walt has flown Hueys. They're gray. They were just gray, and his crew chief cut out all those holes with a J.C. Whitney wood dashboard kit and glued them to the dashboard of his helicopter. And Wayne had the only wood dashboard of a Huey in Vietnam. When we got ready to pick them up, the guys would collapse back to the landing zone. The lead squad leader would remove a colored panel from his helmet, set off a green, yellow, anything but red smoke, and the Hueys would come in. You can see the guys oriented outboard on the outside in 4 different groups where each of the 4 aircraft would land to take them out again. Great shot. I was on the ground with them that day just goofing off, and I took that shot. I thought that was a great shot of the Huey coming in to land. I talked about Joe Vad. We lost Joe Vad November the 8th, 1969, along with Jim Downing, his crew chief. This hooch right here was the only hooch that had running water in our troop. That water container up there and this water heater right here, they had hot running water. Guess who lived there? Not me. I was a first lieutenant. That's where the captains lived. That was the captain's hooch. Warrant officers couldn't go in there. Lieutenants couldn't go in there. We had a free flow shower that came out of an F-100 drop tank that had ice cold water. But these guys had potable water and heated water. So Joe Vad, my W-1 former U.S. Marine Corps devil dog, and his monkey Chico. And he trained Chico to climb up on the water tank and open the top and poop in it. And the warrant officers thought that was hilarious. They'd take him down. This was our volleyball court right there. And Joe would send Chico up there and he'd poop in their water tank. The captains never knew it until they found out. And then Chico disappeared. I don't know where Chico went, but Joe was killed in November of '69 along with Jim Downing. Well, real quick, we're about done. On the 30th of January, 1972, I went down in the Rung Rung Valley of Laos, and this is a picture of my rescue, which is kind of neat. I had a hang fire in my right inboard pod. I was shooting at a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun, and one of my rockets failed to leave the pod, and it exploded, and the debris from that went through my tail rotor and took off the entire tail of the aircraft in about a 70-degree dive. And we impacted the side of a mountain, myself and a young warrant named John Bruton. And the Air Force ultimately came and got us. We were down for a while. Bruton was trapped in the front of the aircraft right there. He couldn't get out. He had a broken neck and a broken back. I had a fractured leg. And when they finally came to get us, they brought an Air Force HH-53 Jolly Green Giant air rescue helicopter. And right there is my air rescueman. His name was Staff Sergeant Harvey J. Picklesheimer. A very unfortunate name for a very, very brave para-rescueman. But he cut John out of the aircraft and hoisted him on this Stokes litter. And then he bandaged up that leg right there is fractured and there's a splint on it. And I kept getting up and trying to help him. And Sergeant Picklesheimer kept saying, "Captain," I was a captain at that time, he said, "Sit down." And I'd sit down and then I'd rear back up and try to help him again. I was trying to help him get John out of the aircraft. And finally he got John hoisted and then was going to put me in the hoist and send me up. And I tried to go back in the aircraft because we had a particular piece of gear in the aircraft called a KY-28, which was a classified code device. That's it right there under my arm. And I was going to go in. I'm suffering what now they call traumatic brain injury. I had a concussion. I was going to climb in the aircraft with my .45 and shoot a hole in it so it wouldn't be any use to the enemy, not realizing the entire area around me was covered by JP4 jet fuel, which had all come out of my crashed airplane. And Sergeant Picklesheimer told me if I didn't sit down, he was going to put me down. And so I sat down. Years later, in Herman, Georgia, I went to the pararescue reunion. Randy Picklesheimer was sitting on the front row, blind as a bat and deaf and honestly near death. And I recounted to them my rescue without him knowing I was there. And he started to perk up and when I put that picture up, he just had a fit. And we lost him probably 7 months after that reunion. But that was probably the most memorable day of flying Cobras, was crashing into a mountain in one. Dean Siner, my Cobra pilot most of the time. That's me in about March of 1969. Before Nomex, we were flying in jungle fatigues. And I was 20 when that picture was taken. I wore a mustache so I'd look 21. This is A.E. Malloy, Commanding General of the 1st Division, who gave me my first Silver Star. He also wrote the foreword in Low Level Hell, so if you get a copy of the book, you can read what he had to say. Great man. And this was me after 11 months of flying scouts. You see a difference? I saw this in the pictures when I look at it. That's what 1,500 hours of combat time in single pilot aircraft will do to you. Also, I noticed almost every picture of me, I'm wearing my hat like that. I don't know why I did that, but I always had it on the back of my head. Every picture there had, but that's a tired kid right there. This is fast forward when I retired from the Army in 1993. I went to work for the Kansas City Police Department, flying, guess what? 086s, which had been provided to the police department. My wife in the back there was a vice detective for the KCPD and was getting ready to go out that night on an operation, I think working a serial killer. They had a serial killer that was killing prostitutes in Kansas City, and they put her out there as bait. I kept hoping he'd get her, but he never did. I'm kidding. But I was going to fly. She wanted to see from the air the area she was going to work that night. And so I took her out in the 086, and this is just before we took off. And she didn't realize that we flew with the doors off. And she was actually, there were two of us up front, and she was riding back here, and we took off out of the heliport and turned over Chief Stadium, pretty steep, but she didn't like that. I'm still paying for that one. In 2015, I went back to Vietnam to work on a documentary with a guy, and I met with 17 members of the 8th Company, 10th Battalion, 241st NVA Anti-Aircraft Battalion. These are the guys that I was fighting when I went down in that Cobra. There are 17 of them. Out of 40 who were in the unit, 17 survived. And we went to Vietnam. Sharon went with me for 3 weeks and hooked up with these guys and spent 3 weeks going all over Vietnam with them. And then down to the south, where we actually walked the ground of 3 different engagements. 31 December, 71, 25 January 72, and 30 January 72, which is the day I went down. They all wore their uniforms, but the communist government of Vietnam said that I could not. And I found very quickly that the communist minders who went with us at every different stop in Vietnam usually like to stay in the bus where it was air conditioned. And so when we went out to take this group picture, I had this uniform in my helmet bag along with my cav hat. And that is the actual uniform that I wore during this tour, flying against these guys. And we took a group picture. Not a bit of animosity, not a bit of hatred. We had killed 41 of their guys. They killed 8 of ours in a 3 engagement situation. The first thing they wanted to know about me when we met in Hanoi in a cafe is, how old were you then? And then for this tour, I was 24. And they said, oh, we were all about 18. So they called me Uncle Hugh. The position of uncle in the Vietnamese Buddhist Shintoist background is a revered position, and I was honored to be called uncle. The problem is Uncle Hugh, pronounced by a Vietnamese, sounds exactly like Uncle Ho, Ho Chi Minh. They call Sharon Madame, and everywhere we went, they would stop civilians and tell them the riders to get off their little motor scooters and give Sharon a ride on the back, and they rode her all over Vietnam on motor scooters. So that's the presentation. This is Texas Hold'em right here. That's Army warrant officers playing Texas horseshoes at Fort Hood, Texas is what that is. But you can put the lights back on, Steve. If anybody has a question, I'm happy to entertain it. You're not going to ask me anything I haven't been asked before, and I would be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Wow. We owe you.
Yes, sir.
The tactics that you developed in Vietnam, I mean, you guys were making it up on the spot in a lot of cases. Can you speak to how those tactics are still deployed today?
Yeah, and I appreciate that. The Marine Corps, of all people, adopted low-level hell as a training primer. And for years, I would go to Yuma to MOTS 1, the Marine Air Weapons Training Squadron, where they trained their helicopter pilots to fly against each other and opposing forces. Everything we did the first units, the first American units, the first helicopter units went to Vietnam in '65. We had never fought an insurgency war before. We had certainly never fought a helicopter war. And everything that we had in store for them was left in the States in 1965, and then it became an on-the-job training deal. Some units, like mine, flew with one pilot in the front and a door gunner in the back with a minigun. I liked that arrangement. Others flew with an observer in the front left, a pilot in the front right, and no minigun. So it just depended on how the individual unit commander wanted to fly the mission. So we had a great deal of opportunity to innovate. The OH-6 soldiers on today as the AH-6 flown by the 160th Special Operations Regiment at Fort Campbell. You would know them as the Night Stalkers, the guys in the black helicopters. They were just in Kansas City 2 weeks ago flying around in downtown Independence practicing for something. But essentially what we did has maneuvered into what the Special Operations Aviation Regiments do. The air cavalry is no more. It doesn't exist the way you see it here. It's all Apache gunships. There are no more scout ships in the Army. And the Army's bid to build a new scout ship was overturned by the hierarchy of the Army several years ago. So I don't see it coming back. Yes, sir.
With your rank coming back after you were through in Vietnam, did you run into any kind of, I don't know, problems with the people, baby killers or any of that?
You know, that's a stereotypical thing. Some guys talk about that. If you're the only guy who comes home from Vietnam and you live in Toadsuck Ferry, Arkansas, and you all know where it is, and you wall all that up inside you and you don't talk to anybody, you're going to have problems, I suspect. Those of us that stayed in, everybody around us was a Vietnam vet. I formed an attack helicopter company at Fort Hood as a fairly senior captain in 1978, took it to Germany as the basis of the 8th Aviation Battalion. Out of 55 officers, 54 of them were Vietnam veterans. One, a poor W1 who just came out of flight school and replaced one of my guys that couldn't deploy because of an appendix issue. Everybody that I was with had a common experience. We'd all been there. I never had a problem with somebody saying anything negative to me, and I didn't worry about that sort of thing. But some guys did. The guys that came home with no one to talk to, I have empathy for them. So, anybody else?
We certainly owe you.
Oh, you know, I was 19 years old. I was invisible, bulletproof, and immortal. Once you have a house payment and a wife to worry about, I don't know that I would. She would say I would do the same thing all over again, but I don't know that I would. When you're 19 years old in command of 20 people, you don't think about mortality. You think about what job you got to do. And the first dead person I ever saw was one of my own men who died in a crash. So you're not accustomed to that. And the war, I will tell you, I've never had a negative reaction to the war. I think if you're fairly well adjusted when you go in, you come out fairly well adjusted. But I wouldn't do it any different. I'd do it all over again, I think. Yes, sir.
Colonel, for those that haven't read the book, could you mention the part about where, when you're talking about the heavy losses in helos that y'all sustained, how in one day you had one guy that had 4 scouts shot out from underneath him in 12 hours?
Rodney Elijah Willis. Rodney was the son of an Air Force Chief Master Sergeant, and he was from Del Rio, Texas. Rodney is in Kansas City right now. He's in a memory care unit in a nursing home. Younger than me by a year and has Alzheimer's very, very badly. Rodney, in learning to fly scouts, flew as my wingman, and on one particular day was shot down 3 times in the same landing zone, and every time we'd rescue him, we'd go get him another aircraft, and he'd go crash it again. And the last time he ran into a tree trying to evade enemy fire. But Rod and I would serve 2 tours together. 69 and 72, we were roommates. And I like to tell him he was the second best scout pilot I ever knew. It annoys him to death. His memory is firm on yesterday. All this, he could do the same thing. He just can't remember anything current. So that's a sad ending to a great guy, but typical of guys that flew scouts. They flew scouts because they wanted to fly scouts. It was not an assignment. You would not assign a person to do that because of the 10 guys that started with me in March of 69, 2 of us were alive in December, myself and Rod Willis. So attrition rate about 80%. What else? Yes, sir.
Shoot downs. How high were you? What was the highest you
The highest I ever was 5,000 feet, and that was that Cobra when I lost the tail rotor and the tail boom. That just spun in. My wingman was Lou Brewer. Lou was a Texas Tech All-American, 1970, I think. And he was in the Cobra next to me. And as I went below the hill mass, the aircraft was spinning, I lost the tail rotor. He said, "Pull it, damn it, pull it." My mother called me "Damn it, Hugh" most of my life. So I knew he was talking to me. And I pulled it and the rotation stopped. We hit the trees and rolled over. That was the Cobra. Most of the scouts, I was anywhere from 15 to 20 feet above the ground. They were not all catastrophic. If you take a 50 through your engine and your engine just quits, you're going down. But the helicopter is remarkable in the ability to auto-rotate, to do a controlled forced landing. Of all of mine, I think 4 of them were what I would call catastrophic. The one with the blood was fairly catastrophic. We rolled that thing up into a ball. But helicopters were remarkably forgiving in terms of being able to put it. We didn't wear parachutes. You can't parachute out of a helicopter. But I think the lowest I ever was ground level because that's what I hit, and the highest was 5,000 feet. What else? Hi, Gene.
Have any reservations about getting up and getting back into a helicopter as many times as you have gone down?
People focus on that, and it was only about 5 times a tour. There was 3 tours, so it wasn't 15 all at once. The crew chiefs had a little hesitation about 5. When you're the platoon commander and your crew chiefs call you magnet ass, yeah. But I got honestly, Jim Parker, who flew with me in '69, flew with me every day. And if he was off being tended for his wounds, Jim Downing flew with me, or Red Hayes flew with me. Those guys went out and did it every day. No, there was no hesitation. After that Cobra crash, I had a fractured femur, and I started flying again. I left the hospital against medical advice. The Air Force was going to evacuate me to Okinawa, so I left. And I got in big trouble for that. But it's called AMA, against medical advice. I actually got up out of my bed and went down to the quartermaster, got my uniform back, and went out and caught a bus to the same unit that rescued me, and they flew me back to Quang Tri. But again, when you're that young and that stupid, and you have an obligation to your guys. We were in the middle of a war. I had 20 guys I was responsible for. I wasn't about to lay around the hospital when I thought I needed to be where they were. So.
It's always struck me when you talk about when
you evacuated casualties, that, do you remember Herbert Hillenbrand?
Oh, Herbie, yeah.
And you didn't realize that Herbert was one of the people that you
Yeah,
backed out.
yeah, Mike, Herbie was flying with the 101st Airborne Division and was a chemical, one of our classmates was a chemical specialist and was in a helicopter crash and killed. 16 members of Hot Springs High School were killed in Vietnam. Jerry Davis was in our group, and we have a placard at the Garland County Veterans Memorial with all of their names on it. And we're going to reinforce that on the 26th of May at the Hot Springs Airport. The moving wall will be there, and Walt is going to go and say a word, and I'm going to go and say a word and recognize those guys. But I had no idea in 1966 when I graduated that in January of '69 I would be in combat as a first lieutenant. So it sneaks up on you fast.
Any truth to the rumor that you saw Dr. McCrary?
Oh, it was not Dr. McCrary, it was his son. I was at the 93rd evac. You saw the picture with the blood. I was, as Forrest Gump said, I was shot in the buttocks, both of them. And I'm laying on the gurney at the 93rd evac hospital, and this guy, this medical aid man is working on me. He's got some kind of thing, he's sticking it in my bottom, cleansing the wound. And he happened to say, "Where are you from, sir?" And my head is face down, you know. And I said, "Well, I'm from Hot Springs, Arkansas." And he hesitated, he says, "I'm from Hot Springs, Arkansas." And I turn around, and it's Robbie McCrary's older brother, who was a year ahead of us in school. And he was cleaning my wound, a guy from Hot Springs. And his father was a doctor or a dentist, Dr. McCrary. And Robbie, the younger brother, was a year behind us. But what are the chances that you'd run into a guy from home that you knew that was patching up your bottom? Thanks for that memory. I appreciate that.
I was just thinking, you're glad that you recognized by your mom.
Well, it was. A long time ago, it was my best feature, but they ruined that. But what else? Anybody else?
Thank you.
Well, I am honored. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.